sort of illusion of progress that black people are living under, specifically as it relates to their condition. So the post-civil rights, post-black power generation, to a large extent, feels that they have arrived. Arrived, not necessarily that their condition is, that they're living the American dream, but they have been led to believe that all of the barriers that once persisted in front of them have been removed. So this book is considered the first national study of black student activism in the late 60s, early 1970s. And most people know that it was during this period that black studies, for instance, emerged in higher education. And most people are familiar with the fact that black students are really the ones who protested and demanded black studies. And of course, I cover that in the book, but it was really that push for black studies was part of a larger movement, a larger social movement that I termed the Black Campus Movement. And so really, when we think of higher education today, 40 years later, there are a lot of elements that were pushed into the academy by the Black Campus Movement. A diversity officer. There was no such thing as a diversity officer before these students began demanding diversity officers, diversity offices, Black studies programs, Black studies departments. Something as simple as a diversity statement, a college pledging its mission to be diverse. The black faculty population during this period went from an estimated 0.01% in 1967 to 4.5% in 1975. The black student population quadrupled during these 8 years. And really, when you think of the presence of black people, the presence of black ideas, really you have to a large extent, point to this massive social movement. And this social movement was one that students, I like to say that wherever there were a group of black students, there was the Black Campus Movement. So I found record of students organizing black student unions at historically white institutions, taking over student government associations at historically black colleges in 49 states. The only state that I did not find record was in Alaska, and there's just not too many black folk in Alaska. But even in Hawaii, there was a BSU. Even in Idaho, there was black student activism. Even in Wyoming, there was a major campaign for black students. I mean, wherever there was and so I seek to cover this national movement in this book. So one of the interesting things is when I started working on this project, I had to sort of reconcile all of the reforms that I just mentioned with the massive amount of scientific racism and racism that still persists in higher education. So, coming through Temple University, we're given an intellectual ability to see, specifically from an intellectual standpoint, the pervasiveness of racism that still exists, the pervasiveness of Eurocentric thought that still persists. And then even, extending from that, there's still a paucity of black students. The black faculty population currently full-time is at 5.5%, last I checked. And of course, we make up about 12% of the population. The number of black trustees is at a disparity. The number of black administrators are still underrepresented. So there's still a massive amount of racism. So I tried to sort of reconcile this massive amount of racism that still persisted after the Black Campus Movement with all of these reforms. And so what does this mean? And it was that sort of negotiation that I ultimately argued that the Black Campus Movement racially reconstituted higher education. What I'm arguing in the book is that this movement changed the ideals of higher education. It didn't change it, it didn't revolutionize it, but it changed the ideal. So the notion of diversity as it exists now really emerged out of this movement. That ideal did not exist. The ideal and again, I'm saying ideal, not necessarily the practice, but the ideal of multicultural education emerged out of this movement. The ideal, I mean, really, so many of the ideals that actually we enjoy when people say really emerged out of this movement. And so I sort of argue that four major things shifted as a result of the Black campus movement. First, that to a large extent before 1965, there was what I call the standardization of exclusion. So it was standard operating procedure to exclude Black people from pretty much all facets of higher education. That was standard. That was the ideal. It was largely not even questioned. And so Black students, of course, forced really that ideal out of higher education. And now you have more of a standardization of inclusion, even though we know that ideal is rarely reached. And so that was the first ideal that I argue shifted. Secondly, really there was a massive amount of what I call in the book the normalized mask of whiteness. Dr. Mazama would probably call Eurocentric scholarship. You could also call it white studies. Whiteness, as it relates from an intellectual standpoint, even from a curricular standpoint, was just pervasive. And not only was it pervasive, it was the ideal. There was no such thing that, as a Black perspective. That was just totally foreign to academics in 1965. And so really the notion of multicultural education, the notion of that you can have cultural relativity, that those notions were just foreign. And so Black students came in pushing for that. And that's of course through Black studies. And that was the emergence of Black studies to counteract white studies, to counteract Eurocentric thought, to counteract the normalized mask of whiteness. Thirdly, I argue that higher education openly and honestly conceived of itself and conceived of its institutions as detached, largely removed from society. The notion of knowledge for knowledge's sake was in 1965 the standard in higher education. The notion that a college had to, in a sense, help to improve the neighboring environment was simply not even thought of. And so what happened is Black students came in and said, you know what, colleges not only have a responsibility, it should be their duty to use their resources to improve the Black community. And so in the late 60s, you had many colleges and universities, including HBCUs, that were largely aloof, stating, okay, you know what, we need to actually use our resources to improve the community. And so you have president after president talking about that the university is no longer removed from the main concerns of society, that we actually have to, and this was largely as a result of Black student protests, as well as with protests from other racial groups. And then finally, at HBCUs in 1965, and really for the first 100 years of HBCUs, there was what I argue this moralized contraption, which essentially was a series of rules and regulations at HBCUs that regulated student freedom and agency. And so even as late as 1965, students at HBCUs were required to attend classes. Now, today, for instance, students are suggested, but if you don't attend class, you're not necessarily going to be expelled from school. They were required to, for instance, at many institutions, be an ROTC. They were required to wear a certain set of clothing on campus. This is in 1965. They were required to attend chapel service. They had all of these regulations and requirements, and many of the HBCU presidents openly treated their students as children. It was just open. They call it in parentis locos. It was pretty much on steroids at HBCUs. And one of the things that I track in the book is really Black student activism emerged largely in 1919. And there was student activism all the way up until the Black campus movement in the late 60s. And at HBCUs, the student activism was largely against eliminating many of those rules. Because in 1919, to give an example, students were disallowed, for instance, Black women students were disallowed from leaving campuses without a chaperone. black men and women at HBCUs were not allowed to hold hands on campus. This is in 1919 at many HBCUs. Students, the genders had to take different pathways to their classroom buildings. And not only that, their entire schedule was regulated by administrators and by professors. And so there was a massive movement against many of those regulations. And I argue that the Black campus movement in the late 60s was really the final nail in the coffin of the moralized contraption. So those are the four ideals. And so now HBCUs, even though there's still many remnants of that, do not openly state that they are essentially the children, the parents of these children away from home. Now, we know that, like at Hampton still, they regulate what students can wear, they regulate their hair, a series of things, and there's still remnants. Just like in all of these other things that I'm referring to, there are remnants. But I argue in the book that these ideals were changed, which was an important achievement. Now, we know that these ideals are not being lived up to, so that's essentially the argument that I make. I also make the case that these four ideals and these four elements make up what I call the racial constitution of higher education. And I in the first four chapters, I track student activism really from the beginning. In the abolitionist era, you had student activists speaking out against slavery, all the way up until 1965, just so you can see what had been achieved by student activists before 1965, and you can really see what students during the Black campus movement were finally able to achieve. And really, there's never been a book that has detailed student activism really during any of those periods. But I thought it was necessary to, of course, cover what had happened thus far. And then the final four chapters actually go into the Black campus movement. And so chapter 5 provides an overview of the Black campus movement, a narrative overview. Chapter 6 goes into the actual types of demands, the types of protests, the types of report they received. Chapter 7 goes into the opposition and repression. There was a tremendous amount of repression and opposition. 13 students died during this movement. Those are the 13 people I dedicate the book to. And then the final chapter, chapter 8, actually looks into the changes at a national scale that these students actually made. And so I want to very quickly just read from chapter 8, just a quick excerpt. It's called Black Students Refuse to Pass the Buck, the Racial Reconstitution of Higher Education. 2 days after armed Black Cornell students marched out of their occupied building, professors at Harvard paced into a faculty meeting prompted by the Black campus movement. In January 1969, a Harvard committee recommended the establishment of an Afro-American Studies major in an interdepartmental center. The New York Times praised the important step in depoliticizing an issue that has become enmeshed in unnecessary controversy in many colleges, end quote. Harvard's Black students were not nearly as pleased, especially in early April of 1969, when they came across an outline of the new program. They were dismayed that Afro-American Studies majors had to combine their studies into one of the existing, and to the students' thinking, racist disciplines. The setup presupposed, quote, Afro-American Studies is less than a legitimate and valid intellectual endeavor, said sophomore Fran Farmer. In turn, African and Afro-American Association members demanded an autonomous department to give the Academy's latest intellectual endeavor that legitimacy and validity. As Harvard professors walked into the meeting room to decide the fate of Black studies on April 22nd, 1969, a Black student greeted them with a meat cleaver. Terrified, some professors thought he would run amok, lopping off heads if they voted against the department. Others saw it in purely symbolic terms. Nevertheless, most did trust the ultimatum broadcast by AAAS President Skip Griffin in one of the meeting's first speeches. Not to make a decision in favor of the proposal that we have put here before you is to commit a serious mistake, creating a tragic situation which this university may never be able to recover from. As the professors hissed, rumors were already circulating about the impending doom coming to the campus. Officials stood guard at the library in the museum. According to one Harvard professor, the shadow of Cornell was spreading to Cambridge, Massachusetts. A zealous debate followed Griffin's threat. 2 hours later, the time to decide had come. All in favor, please rise, Harvard President Nathan Pusey requested. All opposed, it was too close to judge. A head count ensued as more than 75 nervous black students huddled together around their radios outside the meeting room. The motion is carried by a vote of 251 for, 158 against. Before the president could finish, a cheer drowned him out. I consider this a great victory for black students and for American education, Senior Clyde Lindsay told reporters. Instead, it was one of the greatest victories of the black campus movement, the planting of a radical idea at arguably the leading historically white college and university. Black students partied the rest of the night, letting out collective sighs of joy, while the faculty let out collective sighs of relief. Some of the professors voted in favor of black studies due to their sympathy for the budding discipline. With the Cornell guns and AAAS threats on their mind, others were scared into voting. Whatever the reason, the debate on the legitimacy of black studies, the signature intrusion of the black campus movement, received a boost in favor of the discipline's progenitors with that Harvard vote. Furthermore, the faculty placed 6 students on the 13-member committee to develop the department, the first time in the university's history that students had been given a direct role in the selection of faculty. 2 weeks after the historic decision, and arguably the most illustrious HWCU, students forced a historic decision at arguably the most illustrious HBCU. On May 8, 1969, what Harvard professors feared became a reality at Howard, during the student fight to reform their, quote, Negro university into a black university. 6 buildings were occupied by black campus activists, compelling President James Nabret to close the college. The students not only barricaded themselves inside the buildings, but also barricaded the main gate with boards, chairs, and desks to repel a police invasion. Students who were not inside buildings broke into the campus restaurant and smashed doors, windows, and vending machines. Litter pervaded the campus. A fire gutted the ROTC building. The university had a temporary restraining order against the building takeovers. The Howard students did not care, defying the order and Nabret's threat to call on outside forces. The warning actualized on May 9th. More than 100 federal marshals sporting riot gear charged onto the campus and smashed, sawed, and cut their way into the buildings to drive out the remaining students. In their first target, Frederick Douglass Memorial Hall, 17 students were holed up in a second-floor office with a sign on the door that read, "This is a black struggle." 2 husky marshals had to kick the locked door in unison before it caved in. 17 students were led out to the police cars shouting, "Black Power." The marshals moved on to Locke Hall and entered through the framed glass of a plate glass door they smashed. No one was there. A note was, "Welcome, pigs. Unity is the way." In all, during the sweep of 6 buildings, 21 students were arrested and charged with criminal contempt of court. 2 of those students ended up serving 2 weeks in jail. But that did not stop their activism. At the end of the month, 20 Howard students pushed past 2 policemen into a trustees meeting and suggested that they appoint Kwame Nkrumah, the deposed president of Ghana, as Howard's next president. The Chicago Defender endorsed the students' suggestions. He would bring dignity and leadership of the highest order to embattled Howard. The trustees passed on Nkrumah, but they did replace the disliked Nabret with James E. Cheek, who endorsed aspects of the black university concept. In the summer, Cheek outlined a plan for the future of Howard that included, quote, creative and imaginative ways to deal with the problems of the cities, the economically disadvantaged, healthcare, black Americans, and black people throughout the world. He presented his, quote, new humanism at the opening convocation in the fall of 1969 as Harvard opened its Black Studies department with Edward Giener as chair. And essentially, because I have two more paragraphs, and what they state is essentially that the New York Times, then the Wall Street Journal, and pretty much all of the major media outlets started talking about in 1969 and 1970 how higher education had dramatically changed. And they spoke about it within the context of Black student activism, that it was Black students that led to these massive changes. So these vastly different colleges and universities did not come about as a result of the 1954 Brown decision or the Civil Rights Act. It was the Black campus movement that forced the rewriting of the ideals of the four elements of the racial constitution and a massive implementation of those ideals that is without parallel in higher education history. Thank you. So, any questions before?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sure you gave an outstanding presentation. I'm sorry I'm late, but the question that I had on my mind to ask you, even before the presentation, was, do we need now a new Black student movement? And if we do, what are the steps that need to be taken to generate the kind of activism that gave us the movement that you have written about?
Yes. I think we do need another Black student movement. And to say what's going to bring it about and what's needed, I'd say the biggest problem with our students, and really our larger society, because, really we could speak about this in any area, whether it's education, housing, and so on and so forth, is there's this sort of illusion of progress that Black people are living under, specifically as it relates to their condition. So the post-civil rights, post-Black power generation, to a large extent, feels that they have arrived. Arrived, not necessarily that their condition is, that they're living the American dream, but they have been led to believe that all of the barriers that once persisted in front of them have been removed. And so when they fail, when they do not get that job, when they do not get into the college that they want, when they do not get that grade in that class that they want, when that teacher looks at them the wrong way, they think that it's something about them. That, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with Black people. When in fact, those systems that your generation was fighting against in the 60s are still largely around. Now, we have different ideals, but we've been fooled to believe that those ideals have actually been actualized. So when they have not. So I would argue the first thing, this is one of the things I'm trying to do with my work, is so students can realize many of the things that basically still needs to be fought for. In that, to a large extent, we have not arrived. I mean, higher education, as you know, is still it's still a white supremacist, Eurocentric institution. At SUNY Oneonta, when I left, I wrote this pretty long letter of resignation. And one of the things I said was that pretty much every department on campus is segregated, right? And they were just like, what, segregated? We don't use those words anymore. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that I was the only Black male, African-American male on campus. And there were only a handful of Black women on campus. So clearly, there was some massive amounts of segregation on that campus. And then they say, well, I mean, we're trying to recruit them. We open up. So when are you hiring people who do Black literature? You don't hire people who do Black literature. You want somebody that does general literature. And that when you put out a listing for general literature, that you're going to get, first of all, many of the Black people aren't going to apply. So, and then you're going to turn around and say, well, if the Black people did apply, we were going to treat them fairly. And then they go from there to say, we're not racist. I mean, there's a massive amount of racism. And so in the epilogue, what I argue is that the ideals, like diversity, are actually being used to further racism in the 21st century. So affirmative action, which is a very hot topic this week because it's about to go up before the Supreme Court, the people who are opposing affirmative action are doing it in the name of equality, are doing it in the name of eliminating racial discrimination. And so these ideals that these students fought for and won are actually, that they thought was actually going to help the world, are actually maintaining racism in the world. And so, I think you just have to realize the stakes, which they don't, because they're constantly being taught that they've arrived. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. When you were talking, you talked about how the students were at Harvard, I think, were very displeased with the fact that Black studies would be subordinated to racist disciplines. And it struck me that this is still the model that we have, right? That especially at Harvard, Yale, all those places, Temple is probably the only department on the program that claims, at least on paper, to believe that Black studies is a discipline that need not be attached to, a white studies department. So you're right, there's still much progress to be made.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because very quickly, the students were very clear about what they wanted, usually. There, of course, were some more liberal and more conservative students, but in terms of those who were in the vanguard, they were very clear that they wanted an autonomous Black Studies department. But they, not only did they have to fight administrators, they had to fight Black scholars who were unwilling to do like what Dr. Asante has done and commit disciplinary suicide. Like, they were just unwilling. I got my degree in history, got my degree in philosophy, so that has to be a part of this Black Studies project. They were just unwilling. And they are the ones who took Black Studies really in 1970 and began shaping it. And so there was all of these, of course, battles between Black scholars who saw it as a discipline and scholars who were just unwilling to commit disciplinary suicide and really build this project. And now you have you have departments who don't understand themselves to be part of a discipline. You have departments like, I'm sure that happened at Temple recently, who refuse to hire somebody in African American studies. And so how do you build your own department? You're training PhDs to go into African American studies, and you say you refuse to even hire those. And so that's one of the battles that's going on right now. And then people say, well, there's not enough of PhDs in African American studies for us to just narrow it to that. You have what? 12. And how many actual positions are there every year? There's not that many African American studies positions every year. It's just these faculty and these scholars refuse to commit disciplinary suicide, and they want to, and they still view their traditional discipline as superior.
It's still down.
Other questions? Yes.
What was the most surprising piece of information you found while researching the book?
The most surprising, I would say, the breadth of activism. So everywhere. At I talk about briefly, I think it's called St. Augustine College in South Dakota. Black students and Native American students got together and began protesting for Black and Native American studies. And I found this article, well, actually, they sent me this article, in which the Black students and the Native American students had this joint sort of statement to the administration. And the Black students state, or in the statement, what said is, you took the Black man's, and I think I'm quoting directly, you took the Black man's labor. You took the red man's land. And now you turn around and will only give us committees, because they were fighting for Black studies, and the administration wanted to form a committee to look into Black studies, right? So they were upset. Look, all of the things you've taken from us, the only thing you can give us is a committee. And so it was everywhere. Like I said earlier, 49 states. Montana. In Montana, a Black student rushed into a history class, black history, quote, Negro history class, and that was being taught by a white scholar, and basically told him that he's just teaching, foolishness, and that, you need to really be teaching black history. This was in North Carolina, University of North Dakota, I believe. So at Colby College, anybody know where Colby College is? Where's Colby College?
Maine.
In Maine.
Connecticut, yes.
Black students took over the chapel for a week, demanding more black students in black studies. So really, for me, that was I knew about San Francisco State, Temple, NYU, Cornell. I knew about these institutions, but I did not know that that really wherever there were black students were organizing and protesting. And that really speaks to what is possible. And really the consciousness of that generation, that you did not have to be in an urban center surrounded by black power activists who were regularly coming in and imploring you to understand that there was something wrong with this university, with this college. And you didn't have to be motivated to change that. You didn't have to be motivated to sacrifice to do that. And then I'd say also at HBCUs, I argue in the book that pretty much every single HBCU, there was student activism. At Southern University, you had a march of 7,000 students. At Howard, you had 2,000 students take over a building. Same thing happened at Hampton. At A&T, there was a 72-hour shootout on campus between students and local police that the local mayor called Vietnam, right? And so, it just was a massive, one student died actually from that shootout. And so, just the fierce determination of these students, and unfortunately, we take many of these achievements for granted. We just think that the Civil Rights Act was passed, and all of a sudden, administrators just started welcoming black students, started creating black studies departments, started creating diversity workers. No, all of this had to be forced onto higher education, had to be forced on almost every college. And even those colleges that did not have a protest, when the administrators were instituting reforms, they were thinking about the protests down the street, which they did not want to hit their institution. Yes?
Yeah, I got a question. And tagging on off of Dr. Sante's and talking about the generational struggle that you went so thoroughly through, what is it going to take, or are we at a point now where it is about us just creating our own rather than trying to change an ivory tower that is not interested in doing that? Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Like, at what point does the struggle to reestablish that whole fervor, so to speak, and is it time now to just say, okay, let's just do our own kind of a situation? How do you feel about that?
Well, during this period, you had both happening. And so you had students who were at HBCUs saying this is a black college and it should be geared to the development of black people. And so they basically fought there. You had students who were at historically white institutions who were like, we're here, so we might as well make this place better. But then you had students who left HBCUs and white institutions and created new institutions. Malcolm X Liberation University in North Carolina was created. Nairobi College in Palo Alto, California was created by black students. And so, oftentimes, of course, the emphasis to me, I would say, should be on building your own, which you can control. But the fact of the matter is that many black people are in environments that they don't control and that they don't. And so for me to suggest that they should focus on building their own when they refuse to go to their own, I'm going to try to meet them where they're at. And where they're at are in these white-controlled institutions. And so I would say to them that this is what happened before, and this is what can happen again. I mean, a Black Studies department. These departments really were created within 1 year in some institutions. You had nothing. You had no Black Studies courses. And then within 1 year, you had 15 black faculty and an autonomous Black Studies department, and 45 courses in the curriculum. I mean, this is possible, right? But you have to believe that it's possible. And you have to have the motivation to make it possible, as opposed to just complaining about your environment. I'd say very quickly, there's also a tremendous amount of fear. And let me not say fear, there's a lack of courage. Because the 60s generation were fearful. I mean, these people were human, so they were fearful, but they had courage. And I don't know what's happened with the present generation, in which they're just not willing to put themselves, many of them are not willing to put themselves in situations in which they have to sacrifice. And yeah, I just don't really understand it. I mean, even though it's going to better their lives and better the lives of their community. And then they also believe that if they basically become activists, right, that it's going to destroy their lives. Right. You know, it didn't destroy Dr. Santi's life. It didn't destroy the President of the United States' life, who was a student activist in LA. And really, to a large extent, many of the Black leaders today came out of this movement, were student activists in the 60s. And so there's this perception that if you engage in student activism, that you defy authority, it's just going to wreck your life. But that's just simply historically inaccurate.
Dr. Rogers,
yes.
Can I just follow up?
Sure.
And it seemed, though, that we also had a combination of movements. In other words, we had the Black students on campus, but we also had, remember, Kwame Ture, Stokely, and all those people, they were students, but they were also leading national movements against racism and segregation and discrimination. And perhaps what we're concentrating on is talking about what happens on the campus specifically, without understanding that the larger society was also enraged, and we were, you know, I mean, there was the Vietnam War, there was a possibility, there were white students were engaged eventually, and so forth. But we also, in terms of, when I look back at it, in terms of my own experience, we were ignorant in one sense. And Anna and I just came from the unveiling of the Fannie Lou Hamer statue, and I was commiserating with a gentleman, Leslie McLemore, and we were talking about, 40 years ago, what we were doing and so on in the struggle. And what we said was, we thought that we were bringing in a revolution and the whole American structure that was just right around the corner. That we got the white boys on the rope. They can't do nothing. And then the machine came back, the institution came back, and basically put in all kinds of rules. They even created new building structures so that the university that I came to Philadelphia from, University of Buffalo, when they start building the campus, they built the campus so you wouldn't have any more spaces where people could demonstrate. The buildings didn't have windows, and it was very, very. They responded to us in ways that we had not anticipated. That's why I said we were ignorant about how the society worked, but we were courageous, but and we had been emboldened probably by Malcolm and that talk. We could talk bad and we could talk to the white man and put the white man in his place, but we didn't realize what was also going on the other side. That's the way I feel now.
And as you know, many of the student groups were infiltrated by the FBI.
Right. Absolutely.
Before this movement in 1965, if a campus had one security officer, then that was profound. By the end of this movement, and this is also a result of white student activism, you had, for instance, Temple had, I think they had an independent detective agency doing their campus security before this movement. After the movement, there was the Temple PD, right? Like, so all of that came out of this, precisely. And yeah, let me see, you said it perfect. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question or a comment. comment to make. I wonder what type of pressure will the changing demographics of student populations going to bring upon the white institutions?
And
I mean,
so,
we can only speculate, but we know that the white population is dwindling, and the highest level, they're asking themselves who will be tomorrow's students, and they know they will not be white students. I mean, they will still be white students, but the majority will be students of color, who, interestingly enough, are marginalized in the school system. Right? Make sure like 50% of black students don't even graduate from high school. Yet these are the students that will have to go to college if colleges are to maintain themselves in existence. So, when you have more Hispanics, more Latino students, more Asians, more black students, I wonder, if that will create a new wave of demand, those white institutions to make space for those different experiences.
I think so, only if they reject the rhetoric. And so the rhetoric of colleges and universities are we love diversity. But of course, when they actually practice, when they make decisions, clearly they demonstrate that they don't like that. I mean, of course, we're battling this at Temple, right now. I mean, Temple says that the diversity university, right? But look at the way it's treated, its Black Studies department. So if they reject the rhetoric, then I think it could, of course, result in something profound in terms of social movement. But that is the way that activism is being undermined by the rhetoric. And so you have people, I mean, is anybody familiar with recently, I think last year in Arizona, some of the local politicians were moving against ethnic studies in Tucson?
Yes, sure.
So I saw a debate on CNN between, I think, the superintendent of Tucson schools, and I think Michael Eric Dyson was debating the issue. So the superintendent of schools invoked Martin Luther King. It was like, you know what, we are trying to create, equality. We're trying to create civil rights. These people are against America. They're preaching against America. And we want this inclusive educational system. And this is exclusive. So you see the strategy of the conservative is to essentially take the language of the radical and then state that the radical is in fact the conservative. I mean, that's the strategy right now. And so somebody listening to that who did not know that Martin Luther King actually endorsed Black studies would just be like, oh, you know what, Martin Luther King, yeah, this makes sense that this is a bad thing. And so, and that's what's sort of going on. Like, they have to reject this rhetoric of equality and integration and all these other things. I mean, because they're really, on the ground not producing much. And the question is, will they do that? Just because a college says they're interested in multicultural education when it's really multicultural whiteness, I mean, will they see what it truly is? Just because you have a Black professor using Black books does not mean that class isn't extremely Eurocentric. And so they have to, but it's a very difficult sort of thing to see, because you have to be very sophisticated to understand that you can have a Black class using Black authors with all Black students and it still be a white space.
There you go.
And it really takes a lot to sort of see that.